No, that's not possible. My ex-husband's voice barely rose above a whisper, but in the silent courtroom, everyone heard it. He had spent the last 2 days trying to convince the judge that I was a damaged, unstable former rescue worker whose head and shoulder injuries had made her unfit to raise a child. His expensive attorney stood confidently beside him. His new wife sat in the gallery with her arms folded, wearing the same smug expression she'd carried into court every morning. Then the judge opened my federal service file. He quietly adjusted his glasses. He read one sentence. That was all it took. The color drained from my ex-husband's face as though every drop of blood had abandoned him at once. No, he whispered again. That's not possible. The judge slowly looked up. It appears, he said calmly, that this court has been given an incomplete picture. At that moment I realized something. For the first time in nearly 10 years, Julian was afraid. Not because of me, but because of the truth. And the strange thing was, I had never tried to hide it. He had simply never cared enough to ask. 9 years earlier, I didn't come home from my final emergency deployment looking like a hero. I came home in pieces. The medical transport landed at the regional airport on a gray October afternoon. I barely remember the landing. Pain medication blurred everything. I remember the smell of antiseptic, the heavy weight of my left arm wrapped in rigid braces, the throbbing ache in my head every time I tried to focus my eyes. I remember looking out the small window and thinking how quiet the city looked after months in disaster zones. Mostly, I remember thinking I was finally coming home to my husband and my baby boy. Our son Leo was only 3 months old. I had kissed his tiny forehead before leaving for what was supposed to be a temporary disaster response deployment with the Federal Search and Rescue Task Force. Instead, everything changed. Our team was caught in a secondary structural collapse during a post-earthquake evacuation. I helped pull 2 young children from a shifting crawl space before a concrete beam fell, pinning me beneath the rubble. Broken shoulder, severe nerve damage in my arm, a traumatic brain injury, and months of cognitive and physical rehabilitation ahead. The doctors told me I'd use my arm again, eventually, but it would take time. Time I believed my family and I would face together. I couldn't have been more wrong. Julian met me at the rehabilitation facility with flowers. Looking back, I think he bought them because people expected him to. He smiled for photographs, held my hand while the physical therapists watched, and even kissed my forehead. I remember thinking how lucky I was. I didn't realize he had already made up his mind. 2 days later, after I was transferred to an outpatient clinic closer to home, he came into my room carrying a manila envelope. He didn't sit down. He didn't ask how my coordination exercises were going. He didn't ask whether I needed anything. He simply placed the envelope on my lap. I've already signed everything. I frowned. What is it? The divorce papers. For a moment, I honestly thought the nerve medication was making me hallucinate. What? I can't do this anymore, Clara. I stared at him. We have a baby. I know. I'm still in rehabilitation. I can't even lift a gallon of milk with my left hand. He looked away. Then he said words I will never forget. I didn't marry someone I'd have to spend the rest of my life taking care of. The room became unbearably quiet. I searched his face for even the smallest trace of guilt. There wasn't any. What about Leo? I'll send child support. You haven't even been able to hold him properly this week. He'll be better off without all this. He gestured toward my arm brace, toward my therapy schedule, toward me. For years I wondered whether he regretted saying those words. Now I know he meant every one of them. 3 days after I was discharged, I was taken home by my older brother Marcus. Julian wasn't there. His closet was empty. Half the furniture was gone. So were the family photographs. The only thing waiting for me on the kitchen counter was a folder from his attorney. Later that afternoon, my neighbor quietly walked across the street carrying a warm meal. She hesitated before speaking. I wasn't sure if anyone had told you. Told me what? I saw Julian yesterday. My stomach tightened. He was moving into a luxury townhouse, downtown. She paused. He wasn't alone. I already knew. Somehow, I already knew. A week later, another emergency worker sent me a picture she had accidentally taken at a restaurant downtown. Julian, laughing, holding hands with a woman from his marketing firm, the same woman he'd always insisted was just a client. The timestamp on the picture was from before my deployment ended, maybe even before it began. The affair hadn't started after my injuries. It had simply become easier for him to stop pretending once I was hurt. Meanwhile, every morning started the same way. Pain medication, physical therapy, learning how to transfer Leo from his crib to the changing table, using only one reliable arm, and trying not to cry when my head throbbed from the cognitive strain of tracking simple daily tasks. My therapist once asked what frightened me most. I surprised myself with the answer, that my son will grow up believing his father left because I was broken. She looked at me for a long moment, then she said something that stayed with me. Children don't remember who walked away. They remember who stayed. That sentence carried me through the darkest nights. Some evenings I slept sitting upright because lying down made the nerve pain in my shoulder too intense. Other nights, Leo cried for hours with colic while I shuffled through the hallway, praying my strength wouldn't give out before he fell asleep. There were moments I wanted to quit. Moments I wondered whether Julian had been right, that I was too damaged to be a proper mother. Then Leo would wrap his tiny fingers around mine. And suddenly, I had another reason to push forward. Every painful step during physical therapy became a promise, not to prove Julian wrong, but to make sure my son never doubted that someone would always fight for him. I had survived a collapsing building. Now I had another challenge to overcome. People love to say that time heals all wounds. It doesn't. Time simply gives you more chances to decide what you're going to do with the wounds you already have. For me, healing wasn't measured in months. It was measured in tiny victories. The first time I tied my shoes using both hands, the first time I carried a laundry basket across the room, the first morning I managed to lift Leo out of his crib without losing my balance. Those moments mattered more than any commendation I'd ever received because nobody applauded them. Nobody pinned a medal on my chest for them, but they were victories all the same. Every weekday began before sunrise. Leo usually woke around 5:30, cheerful long before I was ready to face another day. I'd ease myself out of bed, gripping the nightstand until the dizziness from my old head injury subsided. The doctors had been right. I recovered a high level of function, but I was never exactly the same. Cold mornings reminded me of every damaged nerve. Rain made my shoulder ache like a dull weight. Still, I kept moving. After feeding Leo, my brother Marcus would stop by before heading to his job. "You good?" he'd ask every morning. "I'm good." "You sure?" "No." That became our running joke. He'd laugh, kiss Leo on the forehead, fix whatever needed tightening around the house, and leave without ever making me feel like a burden. He never once treated me the way Julian had. My parents lived far away in Arizona, but they called every evening. My mother sent care packages, and my father read bedtime stories over video calls until Leo was old enough to recognize his grandfather's voice. Little by little, our small family stopped feeling broken. After almost 2 years of rehabilitation and recovery, I was transitionally discharged from active field rescue service. Handing over my agency field credentials was harder than I'd expected. Search and rescue had been my identity since I was 24. Now I had to figure out who Clara Vance was without a safety helmet and a gear pack. Fortunately, one of my former directors refused to let me disappear. Chief Sarah Jenkins called me one afternoon. "I hear you've been sitting at home too long." "I have a toddler, Chief. So do half the dispatchers in the district." I laughed. "I can't return to field operations." "I didn't ask you to." She offered me a civilian management position with the County Emergency Dispatch and Training Center. It wasn't as active as rescue work. No helicopters, no sirens, no field operations. But it allowed me to use everything I'd learned about coordination and emergency logistics, while ensuring I was home every single evening with Leo. I accepted. Money was tight but manageable. I sold my larger vehicle and bought a reliable, fuel-efficient sedan. Our small rental home wasn't fancy. The kitchen cabinets squeaked and the backyard was barely big enough for a small sandbox, but it was ours. More importantly, it was peaceful. Julian paid the basic child support ordered by the court, but nothing more. No birthday cards, no holiday visits, no phone calls. Sometimes months passed without Leo even mentioning him. When he finally became old enough to ask difficult questions, I promised myself I wouldn't poison his view of his father. One evening, after his kindergarten graduation, he climbed onto the couch beside me. "Mom?" "Yeah, buddy? Why doesn't my dad come to see me?" Children ask difficult questions with remarkable simplicity. I turned off the television. "Your dad made different choices. Did he not love me?" The question hit harder than any debris I'd survived in the field. I pulled him into my arms. "Listen to me. There is absolutely nothing wrong with you." "Then why?" "Sometimes grown-ups make selfish decisions." "Is he a bad man?" I thought carefully before answering. "No, he made bad choices." There was a difference, one I hoped Leo would understand someday. As the years passed, I watched my son become a remarkably thoughtful young man. He held doors open for strangers, helped elderly neighbors carry groceries, and volunteered at the local animal shelter. He became deeply fascinated by history and emergency rescue services, devouring books about humanitarian aid and watching documentaries about historic search and rescue operations. One Saturday morning, he looked at me across the breakfast table. "Mom, were you scared?" "Where, sweetie?" "When you were a rescue specialist." I smiled. "Almost every time." His eyes widened. "Really? But you did it anyway." "Being brave doesn't mean you aren't afraid, Leo. It means doing what needs to be done even when you are." He nodded thoughtfully, letting the lesson settle into his heart. Meanwhile, life wasn't nearly as perfect for Julian as his social media suggested. Mutual acquaintances occasionally mentioned his expensive vacations, his large home in a wealthy suburb, and his luxury cars. From the outside, he appeared to have everything he wanted. I stopped paying attention years ago, until one afternoon changed everything. It happened during Leo's fourth-grade school assembly. His teacher pulled me aside afterward. "Ms. Vance, I wanted to let you know that Leo has been nominated." "For what?" "The State Youth Leadership Initiative." I had never heard of it. She smiled. "It's an incredibly selective program. They focus on community leadership, academic mentorship, and civics." Leo worked diligently on his application essays. When the acceptance letter finally arrived months later, he burst through the front door waving the envelope. "I got in, Mom." I hugged him so tightly he laughed. "I knew you could do it." Neither of us realized someone else had been paying attention. Exactly 3 weeks later, a certified envelope arrived from a law office. I opened it standing in my kitchen. The first line made my stomach drop. "Petition for sole legal and physical custody." Julian wasn't asking for visitation. He was asking the court to take my son away from me entirely. And as I kept reading, I realized this wasn't about fatherhood. It was about vanity. I must have read the first page of the petition 10 times before the words fully registered. Julian wanted full custody. For several minutes, I simply stood in my kitchen staring at the papers while the kettle whistled on the stove. Leo walked in carrying his school binder. "Mom, everything okay?" I quickly folded the documents and forced a smile. "Just some paperwork, buddy." He nodded and headed upstairs. I waited until I heard his bedroom door close before allowing myself to cry. Not because I was afraid of losing, but because after 9 years of total absence, Julian had suddenly decided he wanted to play the role of an exemplary father. The next morning I met with an attorney recommended by a colleague. Her office was modest, filled with heavy legal volumes and framed family photographs. Her name was Linda. She read the petition without saying a word. When she finally looked up, she sighed. "This isn't really about custody." "I figured," I replied. "He waited nearly a decade. He barely exercised the minimal visitation rights he already had," Linda noted, tapping a paragraph with her pen. "Here's the angle they're taking. The filing claimed my past head injury, and physical limitations left me cognitively and physically compromised. It suggested that my demanding history and emergency services made me emotionally unstable." Julian's attorney argued that Leo would enjoy far greater opportunities, financial stability, and a complete home environment with his father. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. "A stable home?" Linda nodded. "We're going to need thorough documentation. I have my employment evaluations, my medical records, and my clearance letters from the agency." "Good. Have you ever hidden anything from the court?" "Never." "Have you ever lied about your physical recovery?" "Never," she smiled. "Then let's get to work." Over the next several weeks, we gathered records: school attendance, medical evaluations, work history, volunteer certificates, and letters from neighbors. Every document painted the same picture: a stable, healthy child and a dedicated mother. Meanwhile, Julian's attorney seemed determined to turn my past service injuries into a liability. During depositions, the questions became increasingly pointed. "Ms. Vance, do you still experience headaches or fatigue?" "Occasionally, like many working parents." "Do you still walk with a slight stiffness in your shoulder on cold days?" "Yes." "So you admit your physical limitations persist?" "They affect my range of motion," I said, holding his gaze. "They have never affected my ability to care for my son." "Can you run? If Leo were in danger, could you physically protect him?" "I spent my career extracting people from collapsed buildings," I replied quietly. "If my son is in danger, I don't need to run a marathon to save him. I would get him out." The attorney didn't ask another question for a long moment. Outside the conference room, Linda smiled. You handled that beautifully. Still, something about Julian's sudden urgency bothered me. He wasn't acting like a father desperate to reconnect with his child. He was acting like a public relations executive managing an asset. The answer came unexpectedly. One Saturday afternoon, Marcus stopped by with coffee. He looked unusually serious. I think I know what Julian is doing. What do you mean? I talked to an old contact who works near his firm. Apparently, Julian has been bragging to clients and colleagues about his son being on track for prestigious youth leadership programs and eventual Ivy League tracks. He's presenting himself as the architect of his son's bright future. Everything suddenly clicked. The prestigious leadership initiative, the upcoming scholarships, the social standing. Julian didn't want to raise his son. He wanted to claim credit for him. He wanted to rewrite his own history of abandonment by presenting a picture of a successful, high-achieving family. The trial began in early spring. The family courthouse was quiet, but the air felt heavy. Julian looked immaculate. Tailored suit, expensive watch, perfectly styled hair. His wife sat behind him in the gallery, wearing quiet designer jewelry. They looked like the picture of suburban success. I arrived carrying one worn leather folder, containing 9 years of quiet, undocumented hard work. Judge Eleanor Watkins entered precisely at 9 a.m. She reviewed the case file quietly before letting Julian's lawyer speak. For nearly an hour, his attorney painted a picture of a physically limited, struggling single mother, repeatedly referring to my chronic injuries and implying my home was unstable compared to Julian's wealthy estate. When it was our turn, Linda didn't launch an angry attack. Instead, she introduced the facts. 9 years of perfect school attendance, letters from teachers, exemplary performance reviews from my civilian dispatch job, and medical clearance forms showing complete cognitive stability. Then Julian took the stand. He spoke confidently. I've always wanted the absolute best for my son. Linda stood up. Mr. Carter, when was the last school play you attended? Silence. When was the last time you took your son to a doctor's appointment? I was working to provide child support. Julian stammered. What is Leo's favorite subject in school? Julian hesitated. I believe it's science. It's history, Linda corrected him quietly. What size shoe does your son wear? No answer. What food is he allergic to? Julian looked toward his attorney, his confidence slipping. I don't recall offhand. Linda thanked him and sat down. Judge Watkins remained expressionless. She reviewed the exhibits quietly before speaking. I noticed repeated references in the petition to Ms. Vance's rescue service injuries. Has the court received her complete federal agency file? No, Your Honor, Julian's attorney replied. We didn't deem it necessary beyond her medical discharge summary. I would like to see it, the judge said. The clerk disappeared through a side door and returned a few minutes later carrying a sealed agency file. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Judge Watkins broke the seal without ceremony. She turned the first few pages slowly. Service history, evaluations, medical reports, and internal commendations. Julian sat upright, looking relaxed again. I could tell he believed the file would simply confirm his claims about my injuries. He had no idea what else was documented in those records. The judge stopped halfway through the file. Her eyes rested on one paragraph for several long seconds. She read it again, then looked toward me. Ms. Vance? Yes, Your Honor. Was this portion of the operational review kept internal due to safety protocols? Yes, ma'am. It was only declassified for administrative record-keeping last year. She nodded once. I see. Across the room, Julian shifted in his chair. For the first time all morning, he looked uneasy. The judge adjusted her glasses. I am going to read one sentence from the official agency evaluation into the record. The courtroom seemed to lean forward as one. She read calmly. Despite sustaining a severe concussive injury and structural trauma, Specialist Clara Vance refused immediate extraction and successfully coordinated the manual recovery of 2 trapped children and her remaining team members. Subsequent cognitive and psychological evaluations consistently demonstrate exemplary decision-making under stress, high emotional resilience, and no impairment in judgment or parental capacity. Silence. Absolute silence hung in the courtroom. When I looked over, Julian had gone pale. His mouth opened slightly. No, he whispered, his eyes fixed on me. That's not what the medical discharge said. Judge Watkins looked directly at him. Mr. Carter, I assume your attorney reviewed the actual operational records before filing a claim of instability? His lawyer looked genuinely confused. No, Your Honor, we were only provided the basic medical discharge summary by our client. The judge raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Julian's attorney quickly flipped through the copy the clerk handed him. His expression changed with every page. Finally, he slowly closed the file, removed his glasses, and rubbed his forehead. That quiet gesture spoke louder than any verbal objection could have. Linda leaned toward me and whispered, "Their petition just fell apart." But the hearing wasn't over. Judge Watkins folded her hands. "Mr. Carter," Julian finally looked up, "you have argued that Ms. Vance's past injuries render her incapable of providing a stable environment. Yet the official evaluations from the federal agency conclude precisely the opposite." Julian swallowed hard. "I wasn't aware of the details." "I believe that has become quite obvious," the judge interrupted. "This court also has before it 9 years of consistent records showing perfect attendance at school conferences, regular medical visits, active community involvement, and outstanding teacher evaluations. I find no evidence that Ms. Vance has ever failed to place her son's needs ahead of her own." She paused, looking directly at Julian. "I have, however, found substantial evidence that you voluntarily chose not to participate in your son's life for nearly a decade." Julian's attorney stood. "Your Honor, I'm not finished," she said firmly, and the attorney sat back down. The judge turned toward Leo, who was sitting quietly in the back room, with the court-appointed advocate. She called him in. "Leo, do you want to tell me anything about your home?" Leo looked at the judge, then at me. "My mom never leaves anyone behind. When I broke my wrist last year, she stayed with me the whole night in the hospital, even though her own shoulder was hurting from the weather. She told me that real strength means staying when things get hard, and she always stayed." I felt tears rolling down my face. Every difficult therapy session, every long night, and every quiet struggle had led to this moment. Judge Watkins quietly removed her glasses. "Thank you, Leo." When she looked back at Julian, her voice carried unmistakable disappointment. "Mr. Carter, there is a significant difference between becoming interested in a successful child and actually being a parent." Julian lowered his head. He had absolutely nothing left to say. The judge delivered her decision calmly. "The petition for sole custody is denied. The existing custody arrangement remains in place." Julian slowly closed his eyes. "However," the judge continued, "if you sincerely wish to build a relationship with your son, this court will allow a gradual, supervised visitation schedule managed by a family counselor. But it will begin with building trust, not with custody." The hearing was over. People quietly gathered their things. Linda squeezed my shoulder. "You've been earning this victory every day for 9 years." Outside, the spring sunshine was warm on the courthouse steps. There were no cameras or dramatic scenes, just ordinary people going about their lives. Exactly the way I preferred it. Marcus wrapped me in a tight hug. "I told you, nobody was taking him." Leo hugged us both. For a few moments, everything felt wonderfully light. Then I heard footsteps. I turned to see Julian standing a few feet away. He looked older, his polished demeanor gone. His wife remained near the car, refusing to look in our direction. "I owe you an apology," Julian said quietly. "I waited. I should have been there. I was selfish, and I convinced myself that leaving was easier for everyone." I nodded. "It was easier for you." He looked toward Leo, his voice cracking slightly. "I kept telling myself I'd have time later. Now 9 years are gone. There wasn't much left to say. No apology could recover the missed birthdays, the first steps, the school plays, or the quiet mornings. Those moments belong to the past. "I can't change what I did," Julian said. "But I'd like the chance to try to be a father now, if you'll let me." I looked down at Leo. He was old enough to have a voice in this. I knelt beside him. "You heard what the judge said. What do you think?" Leo thought for a long moment, showing a maturity far beyond his 10 years. Finally, he looked at his father. "You hurt my mom and you weren't there." Julian closed his eyes. "I know. I'm so sorry." Leo looked back at me. "Mom taught me that holding on to anger doesn't fix anything. I'd like to get to know you, but we have to go slowly." Julian nodded, tears appearing in his eyes. "As slowly as you need." That was the beginning, not of a perfect family, but of an honest one. Over the next year, Julian showed up. Not perfectly, and often awkwardly, but consistently. Rebuilding trust takes time, but slowly, father and son began to find common ground. One afternoon, during a drop-off, Julian looked at me. "When the judge read your service record, I realized something. I spent years telling myself you were the one who was broken, so I wouldn't have to face the fact that I was the one who ran away. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Today, Leo is preparing for college. He still wants to dedicate his life to helping others, and whatever path he chooses, I will be proud of him. Not because his life was easy, but because he learned that true strength isn't about physical perfection or public praise. It's about showing up, staying put, and holding on when the world feels like it's shifting beneath your feet.